Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of South Asia. Before we start the proceedings, may I request all of you to switch off your mobiles or put them in silent mode, because this is going live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and FCC website. The FCC is delighted to host this discussion on India-Pakistan relations. This book by the late Satinder Kumar Lamba is the immediate provocation for doing this discussion. We are delighted to have with us Mr. Ajay Bisaria, who was the most recent High Commissioner to Pakistan, then Dr. Sanjay Baru, who was Dr. Manmohan Singh's information advisor when Satinder Lamba was taking care of track diplomacy. And then I have on my right is Dr. Raja Mohan, the eminent columnist and expert on international affairs. May I now request my colleague Simran Sodhi to introduce.
Thank you. We have Ajay Bisaria with us today. He is a strategic advisor and commentator on international affairs. He's had a distinguished diplomatic career spanning 35 years as a member of the Indian Foreign Service, and he dealt with some of India's key economic and security relationships. He served as the Indian High Commissioner to Canada and to Pakistan. Earlier, he served as India's ambassador to Poland and Lithuania, and he was also a key aide to Prime Minister Vajpayee from 1999 to 2004. Sitting next to me is Sanjay Baru, who is a distinguished fellow, United Service Institute of India and the Manohar Parikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis. He has also been editor of India's major financial newspapers, The Economic Times, Financial Express and Business Standard. He was the media advisor to Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh. He has also authored many books. Professor Raja Mohan is a senior fellow with the Asia Society Policy Institute in New Delhi. Professor Mohan is also one of India's leading commentators on India's foreign policy. He has been associated with a number of think tanks. He writes a regular column for the Indian Express and was earlier the strategic affairs editor for the Hindu newspaper. He is also a well-known author, and in 2015 wrote the book Modi's World, Expanding India's Sphere of Influence. Thank you.
Thanks, Simran. I will now invite each one of our distinguished panelists, first Ajay Bisaria, then Dr. Baru, and then Raja Mohan, to make an opening remark. After that, we will throw the session to Q&A so that you have the maximum amount of time to ask questions. Ajay.
Thank you for having me here. This is my first visit to the Foreign Correspondents Club. I always knew about building in Mathura Road, but didn't know what happened there. So it's good to be here. And another reason I'm delighted to be here is this is a tribute to Lamba Saab, one of our most distinguished diplomats, but also personally for me a mentor. And let me, if I may, just start with a couple of stories which Lamba Saab mentions in the book, and where I was in the room, so this is something that really resonates with me. So Lamba Saab was in fact my ambassador when I was posted in Berlin, in Germany, and he was then posted in Russia when I was working with Prime Minister Vajpayee. So I knew him outside the context of Pakistan first couple of times. But the first time I heard him discuss Pakistan was when Lamba Saab was invited just before the Agra summit of 2001 by Prime Minister Vajpayee to join a meeting which was a fairly large meeting with Foreign Minister Jaswant Singh and the NSA and Brajesh Mishra and others. And this was a gathering where Lamba Saab was asked as a sort of Pakistan expert to talk about what he thought should be India's policy towards Pakistan. What can we make of this new dictator who had taken over in Pakistan, Pervez Musharraf? And from what Lamba Saab mentions here was that he advised on three things: that it should be an agenda-less summit, and it should discuss normalization of relations, and it should talk about all things, including Jammu and Kashmir. So this is, I think, the sum of his advice. And again, just before the Islamabad summit, at the SARC summit in Islamabad in January 2004, which, as you know, was a major breakthrough summit in this relationship, Lamba Saab again came in to brief Prime Minister Vajpayee. It was my job as his private secretary to collect as much information from experts to get the Prime Minister briefed on what the possibilities were. And he mentions this in this book, and that's why I wanted to repeat what he said. He came and he briefed Prime Minister Vajpayee. They had a conversation. I was the third person in the room. And then I called him back. I discussed this with Prime Minister Vajpayee, called him back, and I said, you made some very interesting points, 7 points, which I've jotted down, but please can you write them down and send them to me? So he did come back and handwritten 7 points, which I got typed up and became inputs. And what he said was, his suggestion was, one, strengthen the ceasefire line of 2003. That ceasefire line, incidentally, we repeated that formulation in February 2021. Second, he said no harm to India through Pakistani jihadi or official action. Third, diplomatic missions to work on an agreed code of conduct, resumption of economic trade, etc. So, what Lamba Saab advised finally got into the January 2004 statement, which was a joint press statement, which said that Musharraf assured Prime Minister Vajpayee that he will not permit any territory under Pakistan's control to be used for and to support terrorism in any manner. So this was a very important formulation in those times, and what it did give us at that point of time was 4 years of peace, broken only in 2008 with Mumbai, and perhaps a little earlier with some terrorist attacks, but at least the relationship was sustained in a major way till then. So again, I had the opportunity to talk to Lamba Saab before I went to Pakistan in 2017, and we had a long lunch at the India International Center, and one of the bits of advice he gave me was social. He said, after 5 p.m. in Pakistan, don't discuss Kashmir. So it's okay to talk about it in the morning, but I think it was a very wise bit of advice which I followed to the T, because over 2 whiskeys discussing Kashmir with Pakistan can get very emotive. So I clearly stayed away from that divisive issue through most of my tenure in Pakistan. But I think in many ways this is a very important book, because I was kind of looking at books written by former high commissioners, ambassadors to Pakistan. So there have been in the last 75 years 25 ambassadors to high commissioners. I was the 25th, and none after me. Lamba Saab was the 16th. And about 10 of them at least have written excellent books or written at length about their tenures, and I think that really helps us in multiple ways in understanding the nature of diplomacy between India and Pakistan. Also, I think, perhaps in the next round we'll talk about the subject which you're talking about, which is the possibility of peace. But I also wanted to mention, in a sense, the 4-point plan which Lamba Saab in this book talks about at great length, and I think that is a very important piece of the analysis, a gap that he fills. And in many ways, that was an idea ahead of its time, because we needed to build a certain level of trust before we got to a place where we could have that conversation about making borders irrelevant. And I think it was an idea ahead of its time. It seems very impractical today because how do you open borders and how do you prevent the wrong kind of people from entering through these open borders? That is a policy question that engages all of us. But the question really is that whether this can be frozen and unfrozen at a time when we are able to build that trust to take that relationship forward. So let me stop right here this round and then take it forward when we have a conversation.
Sanjay?
Thank you very much, Mr. Venkataraman. It's always a pleasure to come back to the Foreign Correspondents Club. Let me begin from where Ajay left off, which is the 4 points. And it's interesting that he remarked that it was ahead of its time. So let me say a little bit about the way in which I look at those 4 points. First and foremost, I make an IPR claim, which is that my book, which I wrote about my time in the Prime Minister's office, revealed for the first time what these 4 points were. And when it came out, there was silence on the part of all those who were engaged, including Mr. Lamba. And I was repeatedly asked in several discussions on that book whether these 4 points were correct or whether I was bluffing, etc. There was a lot of debate and discussion, and therefore I'm delighted when I saw this book. And in fact, on many occasions between 2014, when my book came out, and last year, when, just before Mr. Lamba passed away, I did say to him on many occasions, why don't you write something? He did give a lecture, I think in Chandigarh.
In Kashmir.
Srinagar, sorry, in Srinagar, a little after my book came out, where he mentioned some of this, but left it a bit vague. The first point I'd like to make is that the original place where the ideas for a resolution of the problem are there in a very important speech delivered by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in Amritsar in 2006. That speech was delivered in Punjabi. He spoke in Punjabi. But we made sure that English translation of it was immediately made available to the media. So I find in a lot of discussion, including reviews of this book, there is hardly any reference to the Amritsar speech. In fact, the Amritsar speech was the first public statement on the part of the Indian Prime Minister about his vision for a resolution of the problem. And when that speech was made, and it was made deliberately in Amritsar in Punjabi, in fact, we used to joke that the loudspeakers must have been so loud, the hope that it could be heard in Lahore on the other side simultaneously. One of the reasons why it was done at that time was to see the reaction. And I think it was quite surprising that there was very little negative reaction. People forget this. Therefore, I actually disagree with my friend Ajay Bisaria when he said that the idea was ahead of its time. The times have changed. In other words, today it's an idea that is no longer appears as feasible, because in fact the relationship has deteriorated over the last 10 years for a variety of reasons. Right? That's not the subject of this evening's discussion. But the deterioration in the relationship over these 10 years makes these ideas today appear as if they are ahead of their time. But I take you back to that period between 2003, when the famous speech of Prime Minister Vajpayee, Insaniya Jamhuriyat, a Kashmirian, and the Amritsar speech of Dr. Manmohan Singh. A very conscious effort was being made by the leadership in both countries. There were, of course, opposition to both. There was opposition in Pakistan, there was opposition in India. And many people associated with the Vajpayee government, who were then advising people in the BJP, which was an opposition political party at that time, were actively campaigning against some of these ideas in the media. So there was opposition in India to this way of looking at the problem, of making borders irrelevant. There was opposition in Pakistan. When Prime Minister Manmohan Singh took the first concrete step of opening a bus route from Srinagar to Muzaffarabad, there was a terror attack the night before with the aim of disrupting the launch of that bus. And in fact, the Intelligence Bureau in Delhi and the Home Secretary and the Home Minister briefed the Prime Minister and said, don't go to Srinagar. I remember late at night, 9, 10 in the night, there was a meeting where all the facts of that terror attack were presented, and the advice to the Prime Minister was, don't go. He listened to all the advice. At the end of the meeting, he actually stood up, with everybody then standing up, and said, I'm going. And that was it. Next morning, we flew to Srinagar, and the bus was launched. So the environment and the mood then was that we can do this. I think part of the reason was the fact that the assumption was that President Pervez Musharraf in Pakistan also had the clout, the influence with the armed forces to operationalize some of these ideas. It would not have been a dramatic move, but step by step, the bus was one, there were going to be other initiatives. But a variety of political developments, both in Pakistan and in India, disrupted that process. And today it appears completely, a far-fetched kind of thing, that you can actually have a situation where borders are no longer relevant. It will require a reconstruction of the environment. Let me stop by just referring to this, what I mean by reconstruction of the environment. Ajay mentioned the terror attacks which we had between 2004 and 2007 in Mumbai, in Delhi, Sarojinagar market attack in Mumbai and Hyderabad. Each time there was a terror attack, I was under one instruction from the Prime Minister. They reached out to the media and made sure that nobody plays this out of proportion. He would immediately go on television. The Sarojinagar attack happened, in fact, when he was on a plane from Agartala to Calcutta, and he was to spend the night in Calcutta and have a series of meetings the next day in Calcutta. But when the news came on the plane, he told the pilot that we need to fly straight to Delhi. Then the pilot said he need refueling in Calcutta. So we landed at the Calcutta airport. Jyoti Basu was there to receive him. They said, I'm not staying overnight. Plane was refueled. We landed in Delhi. He came straight to 7 Racecourse Road. By this time I had arranged all the TV cameras to be there. And the first thing he did was to go live on television and urge the people of this country to remain calm. There's a terror attack. It is meant to disrupt peace between the two countries. He went live on television urging people to stay calm. Every time there was a terror attack, there would be a live television broadcast by the Prime Minister to urge people to stay calm. So the deliberate effort was made to keep temperatures low in order to be able to take this initiative forward. Now, we don't have time to discuss why they went on. But I'm glad that Mr. Lamba has now put all the facts as he was aware of them, and he was the person who was in the loop right through, as has been mentioned. And I think it's a very important book, but now, in my judgment, it's more of history than a map way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Venkat, for inviting me to be part of this interesting panel. What I thought I'll say is really one, what Mr. Lamba I was not in the government, but I engaged with him when he was our High Commissioner in Pakistan. And later we were members of the National Security Advisory Board. And then I traveled with him a lot in the track 2. So got to know him quite close. And always used to pester him, tell me about the 4 points kind of thing. Being a good civil servant, he would never give it away. But he had a sense of his deep empathy with Pakistan. You see, normally when you negotiate, if you don't understand your adversary, you can never really negotiate. So I think what he brought was a clear understanding of what their perceptions and problems are. But at the same time, utter clarity in terms of what India can give and not give. And to be able to negotiate with Pakistan over a period of time on a practical, realist basis, which can be both acceptable to both. Because in the end, you can have a genius proposal, but if the other side has a veto on every proposal you make. So I think he brought something unique, probably because, like Mr. Manmohan Singh, he was one of the last people who had a direct link to Pakistan. His family was from Peshawar, and his parents had, in the partition, come over. So he knew Pakistan very well. He had, being part of the elite families in Pakistan. Before partition, he had a good, in and reach with the elite of Pakistan when he was serving and negotiating. So I think he brought something unique, and as it turned out, he spent among all his generation of foreign service officers the maximum time on the desk and in negotiating with Pakistan, both when he was ambassador there and later as the special envoy. Second thing I wanted to say was to do keep this book with you. Right now Pakistan is not in use, but will come back sooner than later. There is no single guide which actually explains clearly what India's positions are. And also the negotiating history between the two sides. Because a lot of times the confusion on what their position on the UN resolutions, what did they do when, it gets conflated by the current positions. But I think here is a book actually, you can keep going back to it as a quick reference to when you want to know what was both the record as well as the defined positions of both sides. The third thing I wanted to say was the 2004 to 7 when these negotiations were done by him on a settlement of Kashmir. I don't know if it is ahead of time or not, but it was really the closest when India and Pakistan came to actually agree on a negotiated settlement on the Kashmir question. It had broadly 3-4 elements. One, where both sides will devolve more power to their respective Kashmirs. Second, that Pakistan would reduce its violence. India would reduce the number of military troops there. A third, that the idea that the settlement will not change the borders, but will change the nature of it. That is, facilitating greater engagement across the border. And finally, this was the real innovation of some kind of a joint governance. If you say shared sovereignty, of course both sides will go crazy, but the idea of getting the two parts of Kashmir to have a mandate to work on themselves, that is Srinagar, Muzaffarabad, will have a mandate, a political mandate to negotiate, to govern on a set of issues. I believe the paper actually had identified those areas. But anyway, that was the broad framework. And this was really between 2004 and 7, we came very close to clinching that, but then all kinds of things has happened. Musharraf lost his power, and India too, it was not easy to generate support for the agreement. So that, what it tells you is that throughout the history of India-Pakistan, it is a story of missed opportunities. There are many points, whether it's Rajiv Gandhi, Benazir Bhutto, or when Narasimha Rao tried to negotiate some things with Nawaz Sharif, later Vajpayee Nawaz Sharif, then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and Musharraf. So there were frequently moments when we could do the big stuff on Kashmir, or a number of times where actually we could do the smaller stuff. For example, in the same 2004 to 6 period, a solution to Kashmir, to Siachen question, a solution to the Sir Creek question, and then the World Bank and the ADB done enormous work on how to facilitate trade. We all talk about pipelines, pipelines coming from what was in Central Asia to South Asia. But actually, Pakistan could have got a pipeline 40 miles from across Jalandhar. That India, as an exporter of petroleum products, was in a position to actually, with a small 40-kilometer pipeline, directed in the other direction, that is from India to Pakistan. That it came very close. The petroleum secretaries had negotiated it, but that died. Power transmission today, what we do with Bangladesh and Nepal, power trading. There was a serious attempt at negotiating on power trading arrangements. And then there were occasions where we tried to revive tourism and a range of other issues. But then each time something would take it all apart. So where does this leave us today? The last 10 years, I think the Modi government came to power with a clear sense that the terms of engagement with Pakistan must be altered. That is, it can't be a framework in which India would make concessions, or the idea that the status of Kashmir is open-ended and that there would be no quarter on the idea that India must make concessions on Kashmir in order to have peace with Pakistan. I think that was fundamentally unacceptable. And I think what you saw, but within this framework, there was room for engagement. Mr. Modi went to Lahore, Mr. Nawaz Sharif's house, his birthday, his granddaughter was getting married on a short notice of 3 hours. So there was this boldness at one level of actually reaching. But at the same time also making it clear the whole framework does not. So in such sense, the 2004-7 framework is not something these people are not willing to accept. And then 2019 August, the change in the constitutional status of Kashmir was a clear sense, look, as far as what we do internally is closed. Of course, there was rhetoric about what we do with POK, what we do with Ladakh and all that. But this question that India's Kashmir status is open for negotiation was put to rest. Did that kill the peace process? No. That is the interesting thing. Actually, after 2019, August, there was interesting movement by the two sides to actually begin some kind of a negotiation. While the Pakistani's public position was, look, unless India reverses the constitutional amendment, there is no room for dialogue. But behind the scenes, there was an attempt, I think, to produce some kind of an understanding, which actually led to the 2021 ceasefire, where we resumed the 2003 ceasefire. And if you've been listening to Mr. Imran Khan, what he's been saying on YouTube last few days, you'll see there was a serious attempt at actually producing a framework in which the next steps after ceasefire, maybe the successor to Ambassador Bisaria would have gone there. There was talk about resuming some kind of a trade in one or two items. And then Mr. Modi would actually go to Pakistan. That's what at least the Pakistani press today, or the Pakistani side is saying, no one from India is confirmed. So there was a moment there it looked like, in spite of 2019 constitutional changes, there was a room here to negotiate. And today, Imran Khan accuses Bajwa of selling out to India, but we don't have to get into that. But the fact is, once again, when we thought nothing was possible, there was actually a room for negotiation. So I would say, there's always, just when you think nothing is happening between India and Pakistan, there's always something going on. Just when you think things are going swimmingly well and somebody is with a wrecking ball undermining it. But I would say I'm optimistic because for two reasons. One, if you read this book, you'll find every major issue between us has been negotiated. That is, the negotiating record, whether it's tourism, whether it's trade, whether it's selling oil, whether it is power trading, whether it is Kashmir, Siachen circling, every single issue has been negotiated. That is, the path has been tread, but we walk back each time, both sides. So there is a path forward if and when there is actually a political will to resume talks. So there are a lot of small things can be done, whether we agree on Kashmir or other global issues or not. I think there is actually room. So the problem is not with the intractable nature of the problems between us, but of actually bringing the political will on both sides. And getting over the spoilers in both the countries to say, look, this is a good idea, let's move on kind of thing. So I would say, in terms of actual negotiating record, there is room to actually take fresh initiatives. The second reason for optimism is it looks like Mr. Nawaz Sharif is coming back. If there's one man in Pakistan who was continuously negotiated with us under different prime ministers of India, that he's been consistently in favor of peace with India and trade with India. So him, if he comes back with reasonable qualities, we can never say that. If he and the Army chief get along on the other side, and if terrorism is controlled, I mean, which they've done before, it's not that it is something new they have to do. So I think there is again a possibility that the changes in Pakistan. And the third thing I would say is really the global context has changed, fundamentally changed. That is, Pakistan, which could mobilize massive amounts of international support with the US, Gulf countries, China, of course. Today, barring China, it has very little, and Turkey, it doesn't have too much of support. And that from Pakistan's own perspective, of their reconciliation, I mean, I'm not even saying friendship, settlement, even a minimal reconciliation will give it some scope to get its internal act together. But it's not something for us to tell them, they have to eventually decide. And for India, that we have problems with China, we have problems with Pakistan, that any reasonable effort to produce even a minimal amount of peace would provide us a lot more space to deal with other challenges. So in a sense, purely assuming there are rational actors on either side, there is actually room to construct something new. But of course, we have elections coming up in 24. They have elections coming up. I don't know if they take place or not, but there we are. So I would say the political calendars, always there is a problem of aligning there. But structurally speaking, there is actually new room for India and Pakistan to engage, but on terms that are fundamentally different than the idea that India must make concessions to Kashmir. And I think that phase is quite clearly over. The question is there a new way we can construct a framework to settle the disputes between the two sides?
Thank you, Raja. Thank you, Ajay, and thank you, Sanjay. Q&A session. Those of you who want to ask questions, kindly raise your hand.
The elections are due for in Pakistan. August 12 this assembly is going to be over. Will these elections have any future relevance for the India-Pakistan relations and for the Pakistan itself? Will these elections have any future? It will also meet the same fate as the past elections have.
Who would you like to answer your question?
Well, I think the answer to both questions is yes, very emphatically. The elections are a very key issue for within Pakistan on what is, the kind of political direction it takes. At this point of time, there are multiple theories or predictions on scenarios. One is that election takes place in a minus Imran scenario. That with Ms. Imran Khan out of the picture, with the PTI having become a party that would be definitely minus Imran, it suits the army establishment to have elections where three competing parties, talk to each other and have a weak kind of coalition government. But the other kind of possibility that we see today is that the elections don't take place and there is an extension because of the other crisis that Pakistan faces, which is more existential, which is the economic meltdown. And in that context, there is already conversation about having a situation as in the Punjab and KP assemblies, which is you have a caretaker government and an extended caretaker scenario led by an economist which tries to negotiate with the IMF and tries to get the economy stabilized before the civilian politicians are brought back again. So the scenario is of a technocratic government. But as Raja mentioned, for India, it definitely has an implication. I think for India, there is a need for strategic patience and gradualism. So I think that the elections taking place now or in 2024 in Pakistan and Indian elections taking place after these, I think a window of opportunity opens to do all the things that could gradually lead to a situation of stability and normalcy in the relationship, which means we could have an exchange of high commissioners, we could have high-level conversations, we could even think of leading it up to a SAARC summit, which Pakistan is supposed to host. So yes, the elections are a key factor in the timeline.
Two did not give any they did not give any hope. They said that it's a history. The points that Mr. Lamba raised were, it's like history. It was way ahead of time. Mr. Raja, of course, he sounded optimistic. He sees hope. And I read the book. I have been following Pakistan and India relationship quite closely. I want to ask you, the nature of this government, the way this government functions, the agenda-driven and very majoritarian agenda, how you think that this government can engage with Pakistan, and why do we think that Pakistan would be flexible so far as Kashmir is concerned? So my question is, what is the way forward in this government, this paranoid regime that we have, so far as Pakistan is concerned or Kashmir? How do you think that they can move ahead? Because domestic politics is quite linked with the Vajpayee kind of flexibility and Manmohan Singh kind of flexibility you don't see in this regime. Second, my question is that other way, this government has such an absolute majority, and they have the confidence, the larger confidence of this nation. No government, I think, in the last 40, 50 years enjoyed this kind of a trust. Why this regime, instead of choosing to go ahead and solve the issue that they could have done, instead they did what they did, and they are now, we are in a situation where we don't know the way ahead. Only thing is keep on militarizing the region. We have exposed ourselves further to the threat from outside. I think all three panelists are, their answers are very well.
Okay, so we will take, yes, lady here.
Indian Council of World Affairs. So my question is directed to Raja sir and Ajay sir. Sir, so we see that there is rise of TTP's activities. At the same time, there is insurgency rising in Balochistan, and we have also seen protest in Gilgit-Baltistan for greater autonomy from Pakistan. So how does this entire instability in the periphery affect Pakistan in future? Since we also see that there is economic turmoil, there is political turmoil at the same time, and how does it impact India going forward? And my next question is, since we're talking about peace, last week itself, India and China signed the nuclear plan deal, and today itself, Pakistan and China, sorry, and today itself in the news we saw that China is also assisting Pakistan in the LOC with infrastructure as well. So how do we see this increasing China-Pakistan engagement having an impact for India, and do we see the relations between the two countries going towards peace?
My question is for Ajay sir. We are seeing post 2019 onwards a posture where the New Delhi has delegitimized all the processes, all those processes which used to take in post 2004 to 2014 era. It has delegitimized the dialogue, be it with both India and Pakistan or between Delhi and Srinagar. No doubt India has contained the situation, it has grip on the situation. But I want to know, so what's the shelf life of containing the situation can we say it's a permanent resolution of the issue, or how long it will be contained? Is there any hope for a resumption of dialogue between India and Pakistan, or between Delhi and Srinagar?
Let me take a stab at all three questions. On the first question about what this government, how this government is different from the other two, I would push back at the premise. I think that all of India's prime ministers, if you see the history of 75 years of this relationship, have the instinct of trying to solve the Pakistan conundrum. And all of them have made these efforts. So, if Vajpayee's instinct was to get into a bus and go to Lahore in February 1999, and Dr. Manmohan Singh's instinct was to give his speech in Amritsar and talk about breakfast in Amritsar, lunch in Lahore, and dinner in Kabul, don't forget that Prime Minister Modi also went to Lahore. The first 18 months of this current dispensation was spent in using or in displaying exactly the same instincts that previous prime ministers had displayed, which is, can we resolve this issue? Nawaz Sharif coming to Modi signing in or swearing in was one instance. After that, there was a series of meetings. Sushma Swaraj was in Pakistan in December of 2015, before Modi's visit, which was more spontaneous on the 25th of December, and there was already a decision to start a composite dialogue or resume that composite dialogue. Even when the situation deteriorated in 2016, there was an instinct of trying to use creative diplomacy to resolve it. And I had multiple conversations in this with the NSA, with the Prime Minister when I was there in 2017 to 19. But I think the point really is that what has happened in India is that the tolerance at a public and policy level of terrorism has gone down. So I would argue that particularly the kind of terrorism India faced in the 21st century, and a major inflection point was 2008. Since then, the tolerance of terrorism has gone down, and therefore this government has had to have a tougher posture, and which translated into no talks to terror, because there was an overall sense of not tolerating terrorism anymore. So I think the instinct for resolving the issue was coupled with a kind of rise in terrorism, and that led to the kind of situation that we have today. On the second question on how this links up with Pakistan's internal crisis, yes, it does. Pakistan is going through a poly crisis, and it's, I think, the most severe strand of this poly crisis is the economic meltdown, which I think is a result of the kind of economic misgovernance in Pakistan of the last 7 decades. And because of that, also at the same time comes this huge security crisis. So there is trouble in the periphery, and a political crisis seems to have stabilized and managed. But the economic and security crisis won't go away, and particularly the attack from the TTP and so on. So I think on the China-Pakistan question, yes, that is a scenario of a China-Pakistan collusion, of a two-front or a continuous front situation of adversaries against India, which India needs to be prepared for. India needs to be prepared for it politically, diplomatically, and most of all, militarily. Because that is a distinct scenario in the future. We've got to play to that scenario and prepare for it. And on the Kashmir question, I feel that somewhere the paradigm has shifted. Policymakers in India now accept that India's Kashmir policy needs to be different and separate from India's Pakistan policy. So the time has gone where a Prime Minister would go to Kashmir and make an announcement and say, मैं पाकिस्तान को फिर दोस्ती का हाथ बढ़ाता हूँ, which is what Prime Minister Vajpayee did in 2003. Now there is a recognition that Kashmir policy is an internal issue. Negotiation with Kashmiris is an internal issue, and dealing with Pakistan is an external issue, and these need to be separated.
We're into the domestic politics, but the nature of domestic politics does not automatically translate into foreign policy. Even on a case like Pakistan, which is so intimately tied to our own domestic politics. Because you would have thought the UPA government, which actually was doing so much of negotiation, you would see the Prime Minister go to Pakistan. He didn't. That is 10 years, Mr. Manmohan Singh was there. I know for a fact he was very eager to. In fact, after the Amritsar speech, as the negotiations progressed in 2004, there was a lot of expectation. Mr. Musharraf, there were all this stuff about his village in Gah. There was a big effort to actually make him go. But the Communist Party, is my reading, I could be wrong, was not in favor of Mr. Manmohan Singh going to Pakistan. So that was the situation. So where actually a party that did so much would not actually, the Prime Minister could not travel across because the way the configuration of positions. But if you take the two NDA governments, Mr. Vajpayee went twice to Pakistan, which is wise or not, he went twice, both in 99 as well as in 2004 January, which laid the basis for these services. And Mr. Modi, who went on a short notice of 3 hours, he showed up there. And of course, Mr. Modi also invited Nawaz Sharif for his first inauguration. When was it? May 2014. So I would say we have to be careful extrapolating domestic politics. And in fact, some people would argue, like Nixon went to China, the right-wing parties have a better chance of making difficult decisions, whether it's true or not. There you are. So I would say that the record of the Modi government on Pakistan, whether there were a couple of rounds of talks in Kufa and other places, there was an engagement, and as I said, post-2019 engagement showed that, look, they are like every other government, they've also tried to engage in it and find a way out. Second, in terms of incentives for Pakistan, you mentioned about Pakistan having problems. Don't we? We have a two-front problem. After all, the ceasefire came at a time when you had a serious problem on the Himalayas. So I think there is no country without problems. The positive way of looking at it is, look, if you reduce one problem, your overall room for engagement will go. That is, if you have a track with Pakistan, then the question of China's overwhelming influence, can that be marginalized? So that's always been a calculation. Do you keep up a separate track? So I think there is room, I mean, there is incentive. The question today, as I said, is not willingness, or it is really the political calendars, how that is going to align. Because Pakistan is in no position to talk to it. The imperatives for them to engage India is much higher, I would say. But today, they're in the middle of a huge political crisis. They're in the middle of a serious economic crisis. So they'll have to settle down. But my sense is once they settle down, and by the time hopefully we'll have a new government or the next government, they will be ruled. So I would say it is a question of how do you manage the interim in the
It's not correct to say that Dr. Manmohan Singh was not willing to go to Pakistan, or the Congress party was not in favor. I'm sorry, that's not factually correct. The fact is that in the period from 2004 to 2008, that was the period in which this dialogue was happening. And if in September 2007, the politics of Pakistan had not moved in a direction where Musharraf was weakened by the judiciary, and then subsequently Benazir Bhutto was assassinated, the environment in Pakistan was not conducive for any initiative at that point in time. If those incidents had not happened, if the problem that President Musharraf had with the judiciary in 2007 and the assassination of Benazir Bhutto had not happened, and this dialogue had moved forward, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh would have gone to Pakistan. The turning point was November 2008, the terror attack in Mumbai, after which there was no way in which Dr. Manmohan Singh could go to Pakistan till Pakistan acknowledged the role, elements they played in that attack, the Mumbai terror attack in November. So the circumstances of that period were such that in the second term of Dr. Manmohan Singh, the visit simply could not happen. Though, let me say, and I know this for a fact, that colleagues of Mr. Bisaria and the Foreign Ministry were constantly advising him to go, despite all of this. But he took a political decision that till there is some acknowledgement on the part of Pakistan for the role its elements they played in the November 2008 attack in Mumbai, there was no way an Indian Prime Minister could travel to Pakistan. So it's not correct to say that politics in India prevented any further movement. It was the situation in Pakistan that in fact prevented any further movement. Today, I think the situation is not, you see, one visit to Lahore of Prime Minister Modi, these are empty gestures. That is a completely empty gesture. The homework that you need for a visit like that to fructify into something. Raja mentioned Nixon going to Beijing. How much homework went into that? So visit alone is not going to make a difference. The homework that was being made between 2003 and 2008 that could have created a situation where the Kashmir issue was resolved in a manner that would stabilize the subcontinent did not happen. Today we say, oh, Kashmir is now an internal problem, Pakistan is an external problem, we have separated the two. We can live with that illusion. We can live with that illusion. But in my judgment, there is no way you can stabilize this region without a meeting of minds, which I don't see happening, given the politics of both countries. The domestic politics of both countries have created an environment which has reversed the process that began with Prime Minister Vajpayee's Jumhuriyat, Kashmirian, Insaniyat, and went on till the end of 2007, at the time when Benazir Bhutto was assassinated. That was the period of hope. That period is over. So now we can read books about what was planned, but I don't see the political environment in either country for a return to that. And to simply say, okay, here's a fait accompli, Kashmir is a part of India, take it or leave it, I don't think it's going to solve the problem.
We'll take 3 questions.
2007, when India was hosting the 14th SAARC summit, it was me who had actually asked for a rock band festival at Purana Killa, and we did it very successfully. I asked painters of all the SAARC nations, including Afghanistan and later on with Myanmar, that we brought them together and we asked them to sit at one place and converge their creative energies to bring people onto a different platform. Somewhere I just feel, and I've talked to subsequent foreign secretaries, subsequent joint secretaries, that even after 2008 attacks, we resumed the cultural diplomacy and the softer initiatives and touching the chords of people. Because it's one thing, I understand the compulsions of the corridors of power. But to the corridors of power, the hearts of the people need to be brought together. Because unless the people come together, of what use is a visit of the Prime Minister or anybody or Foreign Secretary? You need to bring the people together. Have we missed the bus in that? Have we missed the bus? Because I remember Farida Khanum coming, and I had organized a concert in Sri Lanka in 2007. I had organized Abida Parveen at Purana Killa for External Affairs Spouse Association. Now, where are those initiatives? I understand that there is a political attack, or there is when I say terrorist attack, and you don't want to do people's initiatives. But aren't we missing the bus on that, Raja? Somewhere. Because I have requested everybody, including Ajay, but there have been compulsions that people-to-people contacts have not been received.
Mr. Bisaria, I am a daughter of Kashmir. I am a Kashmiri, and I am a historian on Kashmir also. And my book, Oh My Kashmir, is coming out, and I've covered Kashmir for 30 years. all of you know, and everybody knows what has happened in the past, starting from the Shimla Agreement. But like we all said, the deadlock has to end somewhere, because we are neighbors, and peaceful neighbors and economically well-settled neighbors is very important for India as well. Leave alone what are the internal problems of Kashmir, eradication of Article 370 and 35A, now whatever that be, you know, or making it into a union territory, as you said, these are the internal things. But Dr. S. Jaishankar, who's been your colleague and foreign secretary, now a foreign minister, why cannot we, Sanjay, initiate a dialogue between secretary levels, then minister level, and then prime minister level? Let's create a situation of peace between India and Pakistan, because this deadlock is not going to help both the countries. And the internal situations, what's going on in Pakistan is terrible, what's going on in India is terrible. These are internal problems of both the countries. But we must have peace between India and Pakistan. I want your sincere comments on this.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask the two panelists who are at the Prime Minister's office whether they could throw some light on the talks between Jan Dikshit and Tariq Aziz, which were presented to Manmohan Singh and Pervez Musharraf at their meeting in Roosevelt Hotel in New York. Because these talks appear to have been the basis for a future settlement between the two countries. And I'm asking you to throw some light on this, because Natwar Singh was kept in the dark, completely in the dark about what was going on. And I was told at that time that there was no record of these talks. Jan Dikshit did not want any record to be kept of these talks. So much so that when Mr. Dikshit died, Tariq Aziz came here under the guise of paying condolences, and apparently he tried to find out, does anybody in Delhi know what went on between me and Mani? And it appears that there was no record of it, and there was no, part of the reason why the whole thing stalled was because there was no record of it. So could Sanjay, who was in the Prime Minister's office at that time, throw some light on it, and Ajay, who would have come across the papers later on at various stages and in the archives? It would be very interesting to know what those discussions were, because at that point of time, I was told that in a year there would be a settlement of the Kashmir issue, but because of Mr. Dikshit's death, everything fell apart. That is my understanding.
Both otherwise, I quickly found out the date when Mr. Lamba met Manmohan Singh. I don't know if he mentions it somewhere, I forget now. My understanding, of course, KP, you know much more than all of us in all this. So, but let me say my hunch. The process of conversation between India and the United States, and India, Pakistan, and India, China, all three conversations were initiated through Mr. Mani Dikshit by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. When he became Prime Minister, these were the three items on his agenda as far as foreign policy was concerned. Conversation with China, conversation with the US, conversation with Pakistan. And in first 6 months, in fact, some people even at that time felt that Mani Dikshit may have died because of overwork, overexhaustion. He had worked right through that 6 months on all these three issues. You were there in September 2004 in New York, when the first meeting between Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and Pervez Musharraf happened, and the first meeting between Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and President Bush happened, and the first meeting between him and Prime Minister Vinjay Abao happened. All three happened in September at the UN 2004. Mani Dixit was present. I don't think he was in the room with President Bush, but he was initially in the room with Prime Minister, with President Musharraf, because Natwar was kept out, as you very well know. So the conversation started then. But he died on 3rd January 2005. Now, I think the answer to your question would be, when did Mr. Manmohan Singh meet Lamba, and when did the Lamba-Aziz conversation begin? Because it's entirely possible, I don't have the answer, that he carried forward a conversation that may have actually started with Mani Dixit. I'm not sure if they ran parallel in those first 6 months, but certainly after January 2005, the conversation between India and Pakistan was entirely through the Lamba process. And M.K. Narayanan, who then became NSA, was kept completely out. He had no role in that. M.K.'s role was only with the US and with China. But on Pakistan, the only conduit was Mr. Lamba.
Well, to KP's question, the records, but I did talk to Tariq Aziz multiple times in Islamabad. He used to come and have dinner with him regularly. And he had several interlocutors, starting with Brijesh Mishra, and then, of course, Sati Lamba, and the conversation with Jane Dixit. So, but you know, the broader point is, in this relationship, not everything is open. A lot of conversations take place which are verbal. Perhaps it shouldn't be for history's sake, but that is the fact. They become so sensitive at that point that they are verbally relayed back and forth. And Mr. Lamba mentions this, that at several points at one point he was asked by Ronan Sen, who was asked by Benazir, please don't put down anything on paper. Just go and tell Rajiv this is happening. So I think that is the nature of the business, that becomes so sensitive domestically that often these things are not recorded. But on your specific question, I really don't have the answer. Should we go into the other?
Look, I think Mr. Lamba did the negotiation and Mr. Mani Dixit appointed. So the conversation had started between Mr. Brijesh Mishra, who was NSA under the NDA government, on the Pakistani side. Tariq Aziz was already there on the other side. So when Dixit came, Lamba became the negotiator from the Indian side. So that was from the beginning. So at least he has said publicly, I think, because I have heard him say, the full record, entire record is there in the Prime Minister's office. Mr. Modi was briefed when he took charge. So I don't think there's a problem of record. This is the first public account. I mean, with all the care that a good Indian civil servant does. If you want to know the record, the book is the record where the broad outlines of the negotiation have been laid out. And I think he narrates different phases of different interlocutors he had. Because after Musharraf, then when the government changed there, you had Shahryar Khan for a short while, you had others. So I would say so it's not a problem of lack of paper. In this case, it's very much there. But it is the politics that complicated it. Look, I think you can be an activist or you can be an analyst. Look, I have no problem. We want more Pakistanis in Bollywood, more music, more cricket, more. There is a huge market for it. At this point, it is not happening. Is it a good thing? I don't think it's a good thing. But as a reporter, as an analyst, our job is to see what is happening. But it's your job as an activist to say we want this, we want more of this, we want resume, we want better visas, we want more freedom of movement of people. There were periods when 2004 to 2007 there was a dramatic expansion of the movement of artists, sports. And in fact, one reason Musharraf came to Delhi, that's when one of the initial negotiations on the deal was it April 2005, the Delhi cricket match. Mr. Musharraf himself came. So I think, look, that we need more people-to-people contact. I don't think anybody would contest that. But as analysts, I'm saying, why is it stuck? That's my question. That there are problems to do. And if and when, as I said, I'm hopeful that dialogue resumes, this is the first thing, easiest thing to do. Trade, for example, which is what Bajwa had opened the door to Mr. Imran Khan as the Commerce Minister, said yes. Then as Prime Minister, he overruled. This was all 2021 February, March. So there were attempts made as recently as 2 years ago to resume the process. But it stuck. But at this point, I would say, please put more pressure on the governments, both the governments. Get your friends in Pakistan to actually demand greater interaction. And it's popular pressure works. So I would say, more power to your elbow. Please mobilize more to demand greater, liberalization, and even going back to where we were in 2004-07, I think will be a good thing. But our job is not to analyze, but there is a job to be done in terms of putting pressure on the two governments to ease it.
First question, second question.
My name is Naresh Sagar. My question is to both diplomats. I will call Sanjay a diplomat, sort of, because he's also in the Prime Minister, advisor. Yeah, but as a sort of. So my question goes on that, can you just enunciate what Pakistan is? Is the ISI the main power? Is the army the power? Are the politicians which are fighting together is the power? Who are the, to whom you people, go and get the, conversation intact, and how far you are dependable that these conversations will hold good? Because in India we have a elected government, we have a constant, parliament, and there you feel every time the economy is in shambles, the power game is in shambles, and even if stability comes, the army doesn't want stability, and ISI on the top of it will try to create some problem for Indian government. Even your fencing doesn't play so important role, although it is a hedge. The entire border is being sealed, but still you have got terrorism either through this race or from that corner. So how do you make the thing palatable?
Just 1 minute. Sorry to interrupt. To answer your question, KP, page 275, very clearly Mr. Lamba mentions that he was appointed as a special envoy in 2005 after Mani Dixit died. So he came in after the death of Mani Dixit.
Okay, so let me start with the last question. What you raised is a policy dilemma for India for the last 75 years. That's not new. Who do you talk to in Pakistan? Who matters there? And that is our job, try to unpack it at any particular point of time. But I think certainly the army establishment is key to any conversation. And there are nuances, things keep changing. You might make the argument, as you mentioned, that the Pak army is a roadblock to peace, but that's not always true. In the last Imran Khan's time, it is the Bajwa doctrine and the army chief who wanted a better relationship with India than the civilian leader who was still a front for this hybrid regime. But the point was that the army was more keen on a better relationship than the civilian government. It was different in the past. For instance, in Nawaz Sharif's time, part of the reason he lost his job a couple of times was that he wanted a better relationship with India than the army did. So it keeps changing, and that is our job of analysts and policymakers in government to try and understand it. And I think one constant is that we need to be continuously engaged with the powers that be, with the army in whatever way. And that is always a dilemma, because as an elected government, democratic government, you would be talking to an elected government. But at the same time, we need to have our channels of communication open with the army. And I think that answers your question as well, because the fact is that the army continues to be an a very important element of the Pakistan power structure. But the point is that we also need to watch how the army changes, because the army's own attitude towards India can change from chief to chief, and they could have a different paradigm. For instance, now, given the huge power differential between India and Pakistan, the army seems to have a more realistic appreciation of India, and seems to have come to the conclusion that there is no military solution that can give Pakistan a better result. The army is also questioning terrorism, whether the costs of that may be more than the advantages they have got in the past, not just vis-a-vis India, but also globally. So I think the point is that we need to be engaging with the army as India, but we also need to be aware of how the equations keep shifting. And to Neelamji's point about peace, yes, of course, I think peace is important. Talking of everything is important. And I can tell you that from India's point of view, we do not shy away anymore about talking of Jammu and Kashmir, and the whole composite dialogue that started in 97, 98 was about saying that we are willing to talk about everything. I think how that peace will come will be with some degree of strategic patience. It will need some creative diplomacy at the end of it. We need to ride out the elections because the elections, don't make for the best of time. We also need to ride out Pakistan's internal crisis, because it's not in a position to have a conversation and take a major action.
Used of, this telling Imran Khan, look, we are not in a position to fight India. He said, what did he say? तेल नहीं है टैंक चलाने के लिए, तो we can't really take on India. So it was journalists, anchors who said, court martial Baju. How dare he say Pakistan army can't? So sometimes we journalists also tend to be more hawkish than the actual army. So I think what he was saying that, look, there is a rethink in Pakistan. That, look, they're in a difficult situation of they need some kind of, that's at least the position Bajwa. We don't know what the next chief might be thinking. But I think this idea that, look, today India's GDP is 10 times larger than Pakistan's. There was a time when there was a notion that, look, parity was the central concept on which India and Pakistan were. So I think there is a sense that within Pakistan, it was the civilians who really trumped the proposition for trade, civilians who made it difficult for Bajwa to push through what initiatives are. So I think we shouldn't go by the stereotypes. Army is bad, civilians are good. It depends on the context. Sometimes army could be bad, sometimes the civilians could be bad. But I think it is our policy has been to engage everyone. Second, on the lingo, look, Ajay Visaria will kill you. That they keep the politicians on straight and narrow. POK means POK. That this is an old language that is strictly maintained by the MEA's Pakistan division. I remember once I wrote this thing saying India-Pakistan dispute. So I got a call from the Joint Secretary. It's not a dispute. India never accepts it's a dispute. There's an issue. It's not a dispute. So I think the basic principles of how we deal with Pakistan, that is, the language is not a problem. That is well established. On the CPEC, CPEC is a new name, but the Trans-Karakoram corridor goes back to the 70s. Well before CPEC came in 2012, 2013. I mean, Gwadar Fort was inaugurated by China, and the idea that you run a corridor along the Indus, modernize the Karakoram corridor and connect it to Gwadar Fort, that was already in place. So in fact, what the Chinese Communist Party did was existing projects were shoved under Belt and Road, then they gave it a new name, but it was already there. So I think for us the problem of China-Pakistan relationship, the deeper integration is an issue. And there was no period where it was not a case, because the transfer of territory took place in 63, when Pakistan handed over part of Kashmir. The Karakoram corridor came in 73, and since then there's been a continuous expansion of China's presence in Kashmir. That's a reality. Look at the stereotypes. Look, there are stereotypes on both sides. Probably textbooks, a whole lot of things.
That's what I was asking. Is there anything in that book?
They announced that Musharraf will come to Agra. A dramatic change in the mood. So it's not that people are the problem. problem is at the state level. If they want to move things, I'm sure it can easily generate huge popular support. So I would say, look, again, I would want to come to, there's always room to do engage them. And I sense the circumstances today, because of the election cycle, might not work out. But if there is a structural change, with Nawaz Sharif coming back, the army chief, they might take a fresh look, because they need to do the question of their trade with the neighbors, they need to deal with Afghanistan, they need to deal with India. India then might be in a position to respond to some of the initiatives, because we're not talking about, again going back to Kashmir discourse,